of our collaborating organizations, the AmChams of Bahrain, Dubai, Qatar, Egypt, Algeria, and a special thanks to Kalman Worldwide, our sponsor for today's webinar. So our audience today is truly global. And for those joining us from these regions, it is a good evening to you. Dr. Hotez and I met a few years back when the issue of the day was MERS. We had gotten through the swine flu, we'd gotten through, the bird flu, and he was a special envoy for President Barack Obama on delivering the mission and the message that we have to be ready for the next pandemic. And of course, he was concerned with MERS, and he came to talk to me about the various countries that he was going to be visiting, and that his message was that these regions, these countries need to invest in their own vaccine research center, which of course he leads one here at the Texas Medical Center in Houston. When we talked, I remember thinking, indeed, that's a really great idea. And it's a little bit like when we talk about the big earthquake in California. We know the big one's coming, but we can't really wrap our minds around it. So when Dr. Hotez is telling me about the big pandemic, we know, we hear, but is it really a serious deal? And yet here we are, 2020, now 2021, a devastating global pandemic. What I want from our discussion today with Dr. Hotez is, I'm listening now. We're all listening. I'm paying attention. I want to know what's keeping him up at night. I want to know what he truly thinks about as a vaccine expert himself. He told me that it would take years to develop a vaccine, and yet within less than a year, we have a dozen vaccines. I would like to know a little bit about how that happened. Should we trust that? The varieties of them. A lot of our friends that are joining us don't have access to Moderna or Pfizer. Perhaps they have access to the Russian variation or the Chinese variation. So I want him to talk about that. And I have over a dozen questions, but I think the best thing to do, because I know he's going to speak truth to us and speak frankly, I'd like to hand it over to him, and here we go. Dr. Hotez.
Well, thank you so much, Aida. That was it's an honor to be here and to with the Bilateral Chamber and to address this group. I thought I'd talk about maybe 15 minutes, kind of give an overview of where I think we've been and where things are heading, and then we can get into more specific questions. And in my remarks, I'll try to address some of your very important comments. So I think you gave a perfect introduction. Look, I served as U.S. Science Envoy in the State Department and the White House in the Obama administration, 2015, 2016. And I practically lobbied for the position. And I did that because I saw an incredible vulnerability coming in the Middle East, North African region. And I'd been promoting this concept of vaccine diplomacy, building vaccine development programs between nations as a way to both make bridges between countries and to serve an important humanitarian mission. And it was based on trends that I saw unfolding in the Middle East and North Africa that gave me a lot of pause for concern. And I've now written that. It's a new book that's going to come out in 2 weeks. It's called Preventing the Next Pandemic, Vaccine Diplomacy in an Age of Anti-Science. And I actually wrote most of it before COVID-19. So it wasn't so much that I see COVID-19 as something totally different. This, in some ways, I see COVID-19 as a predictable culminating event of forces that have been building for a while. And one of the big observations that I've made is we are seeing a decline overall in global health over the last 5 years. So we've made some enormous strides starting in 2000, and many of the Middle Eastern, North African countries had an important role in that, especially the GCC countries, in promoting the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. This is when the Gavi Alliance formed, and we started vaccinating the world's children, and we started taking on neglected tropical diseases. And so this was really welcome development, and we started to see declines in the number of kids dying from measles and all those other childhood vaccine preventable diseases. But then things started to unravel a bit in 2015, and the forces that were causing the unraveling were not intuitive. They were things that went outside the biomedical sphere, things that we ordinarily think about as physician scientists, things like war, political collapse, urbanization, deforestation, climate change, and this rise in anti-science. And I looked around the world and said, okay, based on those forces, where are the hotspot areas emerging? And Venezuela was clearly one of them, with the shift to the Maduro regime and the socioeconomic collapse there, but also a big climate change component. But overwhelmingly, the big hotspot area that really scared me was the Arabian Peninsula in the Middle East. And because that region represents sort of the perfect storm of all of those forces. We can sort of go through them one by one, but clearly war, political collapse, political instability, that's a big driver. We've seen this in the former ISIS-occupied areas of Syria and Iraq, how that collapsed the health system infrastructure, brought back measles. It also caused the steep rise in a parasitic infection transmitted by sandflies known as leishmaniasis, which is a highly disfiguring illness affecting especially girls and women who were permanently scarred and stigmatized. We saw it in Yemen with what was happening there, rise in similar diseases, a horrific cholera epidemic there, maybe the world's worst cholera epidemic ever recorded, possibly in Yemen. We still don't know the full extent of it. Also, so beyond war and political collapse, you also have the annual Umrah and Hajj, which is bringing in people from all over the Muslim world, and many scientists believe that's how dengue gained a foothold in and around Jeddah and Saudi Arabia, because the Aedes aegypti and Aedes mosquitoes were already there. People bringing in with dengue and meningococcal illness, so that's a second driver. And then the third is climate change. We're seeing historic temperature rises and drought in many parts of the Middle East, including, historic agricultural lands around the Tigris and Euphrates, right? So these are causing people to abandon ancient agricultural pursuits and move into the cities. And many scholars, look at climate change as actually a precipitating factor that may have helped promote all the instability in the Middle East, leading to some of the hostilities that we've actually seen, and water shortages and competition for water. And so what you have in the Arabian Peninsula and then elsewhere in the Middle East is this perfect storm of all of these forces. And, during my time as U.S. Science Envoy, I made multiple trips to Saudi Arabia. And, I would point out, look to the north of you, what you've got between Syria and Iraq, and the south of you in Yemen. And basically, I would say, to be provocative, all roads point to Riyadh, all right? That this is where we're going to see a big impact. And it's for the health security of the country. It's really important that we build up vaccine infrastructure, and not only in Saudi Arabia, but elsewhere as well. And I also pointed out for Saudi Arabia, we don't have sufficient numbers of halal vaccines available for the Muslim world either. And this could be an important role for Saudi as well as the other GCC countries. So that was my charge, to kind of see if we can really build up vaccine development infrastructure. And one of the advantages of what I'm doing is as co-heading with my science partner for the last 20 years, Mary Elena Bottazzi, a unique center at Texas Children's Hospital and Baylor College of Medicine, where we set up the School of Tropical Medicine, but also this unique center for vaccine development that makes vaccines for all of the diseases that the pharma companies ordinarily would not be interested in, like a leishmaniasis vaccine and a Chagas disease vaccine, oftentimes diseases of the poor, and vulnerable that don't have a financial means to be able to pay for those vaccines. These diseases were falling through the cracks. So we built up that center. But the interesting thing when, I think over the years when I've been speaking with you, I've sort of focused on that, but we never really talked about our coronavirus vaccine program. But about a decade ago, we took on a coronavirus vaccine program in partnership with the New York Blood Center, in part because these were the same deal, that nobody cared about coronavirus vaccines. We knew they were going to be huge issues because we had seen SARS in 2003, then we saw MERS in 2012. And I said, holy cow, every 10 years, we're going to see a big coronavirus epidemic. So we started a program. And so that gets to your first question, how is it that these vaccines arose out of nowhere? Well, in a few months, well, they didn't. This has been an 11-year R&D effort led by us and colleagues to first identify the spike protein of the virus as the soft underbelly of the virus, the soft target, figuring out ways to deliver the spike protein in order to induce an immune response, and then providing proof of concept that if you make high levels of virus neutralizing antibody to the spike protein, you'll have a coronavirus vaccine. So, and I think that's an important point to make, because a lot of the reason why people are skittish about taking COVID-19 vaccines is say it's all too rushed. Well, it wasn't. It's an 11-year time frame, which is not too atypical for a vaccine development program. If we hadn't done, and our colleagues hadn't done that R&D for the last decade, working out all about the spike protein, we would never have vaccines by now. It's because we did that work. And so that when the Chinese put up the COVID-19 virus sequence on bioRxiv in January, about a year ago, at this time, I think just about a year ago at this time, we looked at that sequence and said, you know what, we got this. Yeah, we can do this, because we knew how to deliver spike proteins vaccines, and we knew the receptor binding domain was the particular component of it. And that's when everyone just did plug and play, basically took all of their platform technologies that they were working on SARS and MERS and now adapted it to the COVID-19 virus. And it was that straightforward. And that's why you're seeing so many vaccines roll out now. So what you've got now is the thing that we're trying to avoid, and unfortunately the momentum is still building in that direction, was a two-tiered system. When I first saw this happening, I tried to signal the alarm that what you would see is sort of the high technology vaccines be reserved for North America and Europe, and sort of the low-tech vaccines for everywhere else. The only good news was that I think because the spike protein is such a soft target, I think the low-tech vaccines probably would work just as well. But the advantage on the mRNA technology is you can make a piece of mRNA pretty quickly, and that's why you're seeing the mRNA vaccines from Moderna and Pfizer's first out of the starting gate. But the problem with those mRNA vaccines is that the technology is still immature, in the sense that you still need that onerous freezer requirement. It's hard to scale it up. So I've actually been saying, even in the US, the intent was never to rely on the mRNA vaccines to be our workhorse. That was to get us started. I mean, eventually it could reach that point. Eventually the technology will be refined to the point where you can keep those vaccines at room temperature and fine tune them, I think, over the next few years. But for now, production's an issue, and everything else. And so we're going to need other vaccines. And that's where I'm pushing very hard on the US side to expand our ability to vaccinate the US population. We're going to have to get the other vaccines up, like the J&J vaccine, which is an adenovirus technology, the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, and our vaccine. So we have a recombinant protein vaccine that's made in yeast, really old school vaccine, in the sense it's the same technology used to make the recombinant hepatitis B vaccine that's been in use for 4 decades, including immunizing kids. And now, so Baylor has embarked and entered a licensing agreement with Biological E, BioE, in Hyderabad, India. They're now scaling up to make 1.2 billion doses, and that's very exciting because we've never made a billion of anything before. And now being tested across India, and it's looking really promising. And I've now sort of gone back to talk with people like Mazen Hassanein and Saudi Vax to say, hey, Mazen, we could transfer that technology to you guys, pretty easily. I mean, this is a pretty robust technology, refrigerator, well-proven technology for safety, easy to scale it up. And when you invited me to speak to the Bilateral Chamber, I was excited about that possibility because I think we could do the same with a number of um, countries in the Middle East and North Africa. It's a good starter vaccine in the sense that because it's probably one of the most straightforward technologies there is, microbial fermentation in yeast and isolating and producing a recombinant protein vaccine, and that if a nation has aspirational goals for self-sufficiency in developing new vaccines, this is a good test case for it to begin that scale up. So maybe we can have that discussion as well. And so now it's really a race. We're seeing such a high level and aggressive level of virus transmission. And unfortunately, in the U.S. and many parts of Europe, there's really not been a well thought out COVID-19 containment program. Now we're sort of backed into a corner. We're going to have to vaccinate our way through it. So that's going to be the challenge now, getting as many vaccines out there with more robust technology so we can vaccinate the country. But again, we're still, when you look around the landscape globally, things are not looking so great because the mRNA vaccines probably are not going to be available. The Chinese and the Russian vaccines are of unknown quality, and whether they'll go through WHO pre-qualification mechanisms is unclear, and the level of efficacy. So once you take away those, and now Sanofi's had big delays, the Queensland Australia group has big delays. There's not a heck of a lot out there, really. I mean, there's the AstraZeneca Oxford adenovirus vaccine, the J&J vaccine, maybe our vaccine, maybe one or two others. So, as things progress, we're seeing a number of players drop out. And again, we'd be more than happy to help in the Middle East. And it's a region I've fallen in love with over the years. And if we can be of help in transferring technology to one of the countries in the Middle East, North Africa, we'd help with that, or anything I can do to offer advice on vaccines and vaccine development, I'm happy to do that as well. So those are sort of my introductory remarks, and happy to go in any direction you'd like at this point, Aida.
Okay, great. That was great. I have a lot of questions, but let's start with something immediate, which is people in the Middle East. A lot of people have access to I think it's called the Sinopharm, which is the Chinese vaccine. If your recommendation, and you were out there, would you just take your chances with the disease and getting it and getting over it, and not take the vaccine? Or is your advice that they should take the vaccine?
Yeah, the Sinopharm technology is well, I have to see what, there's so many different Chinese vaccines right now. I'd have to look at which one that is. If it's the inactivated virus vaccine, it looks interesting, right? I mean, talk about old school. That is about old as school as you get. It's like the polio vaccine approach, where you grow up the virus. In the case of polio, it's inactivated with formalin. In the case of the Chinese inactivated virus vaccine, I think it's beta-propionolactone, and then it's formulated with alum. It's, as I say, about as old school as you get. I think it should work in terms of inducing virus neutralizing antibodies. The numbers that I've seen have been a bit all over the map in terms of 50% protection, 60% protection. So I'm not so concerned about the platform per se. For instance, Bharat in Hyderabad is also making an inactivated virus vaccine. So I think, it certainly could work. The problem that we've had with Chinese vaccines historically has been quality control and quality assurance. And I think that's an important point, because when the Russians developed their gamma-layer adenovirus vaccine, they called it Sputnik 5 or Sputnik V, and there was a lot of chest thumping about, what an heroic scientific achievement this was. It wasn't a heroic scientific achievement. We've known that we can target the spike protein of the virus, so that the tough part of vaccines and for this virus is not the science, it's the quality control, quality assurance, making certain that you're doing the clinical trials under good clinical regulatory practices. And that's why I was quite outspoken in my criticism of the Russians, that and the fact that they're the single largest contributor to anti-vaccine bots and trolls. And so the irony of that was when the Russians were outraged that I was criticizing them, and here they are, the single largest promoter of anti-vaccine disinformation, and their shock now when it comes back to bite them a little bit. But if that's all you have access to, I would probably take the Chinese vaccine. My preference, and I think they're doing this, is that they work more with the WHO and the pre-qualification mechanism, so that there's that level of adequate oversight.
Well, speaking of, information, misinformation, we've had a lot of questions about back to, what is the source of the COVID-19 virus? Do we know that it was in the wet market? Do we know that it was for sure that it was transmitted from animal, maybe bat, snakes, whatever? Is this the source? From the perspective of scientists?
Well, after the event occurred, the Chinese destroyed that wet market. So we're never going to know for certain all of the origins. Beta coronaviruses circulate in bats. In fact, bats are the source of a wide variety of serious human pathogens. Now, Ebola comes from bats. Nipah virus comes from bats. Beta coronaviruses come from bats predominantly. They're natural reservoirs of this. And so the thinking is that it likely jumped from bats to some other animal reservoir, possibly one that is used in one of these wet markets. So for instance, in the case of SARS-1, it was through civet cats, which are an animal used locally in the markets for, I don't know, either for food or for exotic things. In the case of mares, it jumped from bats to presumably camels, and that's how it became an important human pathogen. In the case of COVID-19, I don't think we fully understand that it possibly jumped directly from bats to humans or cycled through another animal. I know there's a lot of conspiracy theories about there that the Chinese made it in the Wuhan laboratory. I don't think the evidence for that is strong at all. Then there are others who point out that there was an illness that resembled COVID-19 that started in a different part of Hubei province, maybe over the summer of 2019, and maybe it didn't really arise out of Wuhan at all, that it began in a distant part of the same province, in Hubei province. So this will take time to sort out, but at this point, beyond the academic interest and beyond its role in looking at the virus ecology to prevent future outbreaks, I don't think it'll have much bearing on this particular pandemic.
Well, now here we are, just when we've had some good news, even though the rollout globally of any vaccine is still a little bit bleak, but it's some light at the end of the tunnel. And then we hear about a mutant variant of COVID, one in South Africa, one in Great Britain. I mean, is this the future? And do we know for sure that any of these vaccines are going to give us any protections on this new strain, which seems to be even more infectious?
Yeah, so the COVID-19 virus is an RNA virus, and RNA viruses mutate. That's something RNA viruses do. The mutation rate for the COVID-19 virus, the SARS coronavirus type 2, tends to be relatively slow, but we have seen now there's so much virus transmission going on. We're starting to see some lineages emerge that have more mutations than we might ordinarily expect. And And these lineages are useful for tracing the geography of the virus. So for instance, one of the reasons why we know the virus that caused that horrible New York City epidemic back last spring, back in March and April, came from Southern Europe, was because of the similarity in the mutation profile of the two viruses. So we can use it to trace geography and lineages. In this case, there seems to be have emerged some lineages with many more mutations than one might expect, and there's some speculation that maybe it amplified in an individual is immunocompromised. It's a possibility, but what's happened in the UK is there's a variant there that in southeastern England, like in Kent, it now occupies about half of the virus isolates. So the point is, it has the ability to outcompete the other virus isolates. And on that basis, the modeling says it's more transmissible. We actually do not have experimental evidence showing it is more transmissible. It's still conjectured. I think it probably is the case. So we have the UK variant that's doing that. We have one from South Africa. My point is, in the US, we probably have several like this. It's just that we're not looking for them. We've really, in so many ways, the United States has underperformed in terms of our health system. And one of the ways we've underperformed is we never got the genomic sequencing off the ground. So Australia, for instance, has sequenced about 50% of its COVID-19 virus isolates, the UK 10%, the US 0.3%. So, even though we're the we have the world's largest capacity for virus genomic sequencing, we've got the Broad Institute at Harvard, MIT, and the New York Genome Center, and University of Washington, and Baylor College of Medicine, Washington University in St. Louis. We've just not organized ourselves, which is profoundly disappointing. So we should be at 10 million virus genome sequences by now. We're at about 50,000. So the likelihood is there are many more variants out there. In terms of vaccine development, so far, to me, looking at the sequences, I don't think this is going to be a problem for our current crop of vaccines. Looking at the mutations, we're actually confirming that, though, with a group at Duke University that has both the variant and the pseudovirus variant, and to show that that neutralizing antibodies from our vaccine and other vaccines will cross-neutralize, but we don't know that for a fact yet.
What about the side effects for people that have, for instance, like I noticed at MD Anderson, they're not yet deploying the vaccine for their patients, cancer patients. What about people that have, I see a question about someone who has Bell's palsy. I think that's how you pronounce it. And what are the effects, the risks of the vaccine to people like that have
Yeah,
these other.
I'm surprised to learn that the MD Anderson cancer patients are not being offered the mRNA vaccines. That's I don't understand the basis for that, because there's no reason why those individuals should not be able to tolerate the vaccine unless these are patients going under some kind of specific immune therapy that they think the RNA vaccine would alter. So I'm a bit surprised by that. That doesn't quite make sense to me. We have seen Bell's palsy in the clinical trials. That's actually an temporary facial paralysis, because it's oftentimes an autoimmune response against the facial nerve. It causes a droop on the side of the face. So there were some Bell's palsy cases in the large clinical trials with the mRNA vaccines, but there are also some in the controls as well. So Bell's palsy is something that occurs. It looks like it may be somewhat more common in the vaccine groups, but it's still a rare event. And we'll know much better as we start scaling up. Remember, as large as these clinical trials are, and they were robust, well-done clinical trials, we're now going to be going from the tens of thousands to the tens of millions. So we'll collect a lot more information. But the point is, it's all about risk versus benefit. Right now, COVID-19 at 4,000 deaths per day is the single leading cause of death on a daily basis in the United States. And we have to keep that in mind.
Incredible.
It is
Absolutely.
incredible. And so this is just devastating the nation. So, when people say, well, I'm worried about, the 1 in 100,000 severe allergic reactions, I say, really? That's what you're worried about? I mean, your risk of dying from COVID-19 is far greater. So sometimes people don't really quite understand risk versus benefit very well.
Let's actually, on that note about risk versus benefit, there are a lot of people, of course, that have already been infected with COVID-19, and a lot of fortunate people that recuperated just fine. And would you agree that still the majority of people that would get it would generally recuperate? And I don't know if you would agree with that, so we'll address that. But those that have gotten COVID and recuperated, do they still need to take the vaccine?
Yeah, I mean, if you have risk factors, including age, and by the way, everyone talks about over the age of 65, but in fact, if you look at the Hispanic and African American communities, a third of the deaths are under the age of 65. So it's, mothers and fathers in their 40s, 50s, early 60s. And even if, you're not dying from COVID-19, it could be a horrible disease in terms of the long haul effects and impact on neurologic functioning, cognitive functioning, depression, vascular injury, lung injury. It's a horrible disease. This is not a disease you want to get, and you want to take all steps to avoid getting it. Yes, most people recover, but that's true of almost any catastrophic infectious disease. I mean, even Ebola, right? I mean, 60% of people who get Ebola recover, but it's not something you would ever want to ever want to get. So I don't think that I don't think thinking in that way is the way to go. Recognizing that it is the leading cause of mortality right now in the U.S. and many countries. And if you've been infected before, we don't know about your durability of protection. I think it may have to do with the severity of illness. So there's a rough correlation between severity of illness and your level of virus neutralizing antibodies. So if you have severe illness and are hospitalized, on average, you have really high levels of virus neutralizing antibodies. If you're symptomatic but not hospitalized, sort of middling levels, and asymptomatic or low grade symptoms, very low levels, and then antibody levels decline to the point where in the asymptomatic individuals, and by now it may be undetectable. But as my colleague Akiko Awasaki points out at Yale, that you still have memory B and T cells, so you may still have some level of protection. However, I think if you were to get vaccinated, you would just get a big boost. And so my recommendation is still, if you've been infected before, if you have access to the vaccine, to get vaccinated. And it's almost like a second and third dose of the vaccine, the first being your primary infection. And the problem is, in terms of operationalizing who's been infected and who's not, it's not really feasible. So when you're looking at the US, about a fourth of the country has already been infected, and there's no way really to operationalize doing pre-vaccination antibody titers. So they're thinking is just go ahead and vaccinate.
So another question is about children. And one question was maybe children that have had cancer and maybe are in remission. Would you recommend that people get their children immunized?
Well, right now we don't have the safety and efficacy data to justify vaccinating children. Those studies are underway. And I think hopefully by the fall we'll have that information. And then I think yes. And that's, by the way, that's another attractive aspect, I think, of our vaccine, is that because it's been given to children for 40 years when they get vaccinated for hepatitis B, the same platform technology, we think ours might be coming really handy as a pediatric vaccine as well, if we can identify a partner to help bring it into the US or Europe or the Middle East.
I see a rather scientific question, and so let me try to articulate it as well as I can. The question is that the COVID vaccine is different than others because they inject an mRNA that goes inside the cell nucleus to give a message to the DNA. So what is your take on any negative effects on the DNA?
So actually, not quite. So if you remember from your high school biology, you had the cell, and then you had the nucleus, and then the cytoplasm. You see, Aida, this is why you had to take high school biology. You had to
Yes, yes.
learn about mRNA vaccines. So the mRNA does not go into the nucleus. It goes into the cytoplasm of the cell and gets made into protein. So it does not get made into DNA. It does not go into the nucleus. And unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a very aggressive anti-vaccine movement in the US and in Europe. And one of their fake tenets is that the RNA vaccines are modifying your DNA. There's even a new term they've come up with. They call them genetically modified humans. You heard of genetically modified organisms. Now they're genetically modified humans. So it's all garbage. It's not the case. There's a lot of deliberate misinformation being thrown out there that it modifies your DNA, or that there's a chip being implanted in vaccines. And they say that me and Bill Gates and Tony Fauci are putting chips into there. And I don't know where I get the time to do that, especially how I get to Area 51 to do it. That's the, how you get out there. I'll have to figure that one out. Then, they're saying vaccines cause infertility. This is a very, we've got a very aggressive disinformation movement out there. It's very frustrating.
Hmm. Well, a lot of people, of course, have likened this experience and with, the Spanish flu experience and the devastation that caused. I've seen some questions about when we endured what they call the Spanish flu, although it wasn't from Spain. It seemed to burn itself out, didn't it? After 2 years, did it burn itself out and disappear? Did it become the flu as we know it now? Is COVID going to sort of be that with us? It's going to kind of be like a wildfire, go through the world, and then, in a way, I guess herd immunity. Is that where
Well,
we're eventually heading? Because we can't get the vaccine out in time for everybody, right?
Well, remember, with the 1918 flu pandemic, it went on for years until 1921, 1922, 4 years. Remember when Woodrow Wilson got sick with that flu, the Spanish flu, as it wasn't really Spanish, its origins were the U.S. But when Woodrow Wilson got sick at the Treaty of Versailles, it was in 1919. So this went on for 4 years before it rifled through the entire global population, and possibly by then there was some degree of herd immunity, but in the process of that caused some of the greatest destruction of any global pandemic in modern history. And that's what we want to avoid with COVID-19. And that's the whole reason for trying to vaccinate the world as quickly and as efficiently as we can, because the numbers are pretty bad. I mean, we're already going to be up to about 400,000 Americans who will lose their lives by the time of the inauguration next week. And that's the same number of American GIs who lost their lives in World War II. I mean, that's how awful this is. And I've made the statement that we're going to probably, unless we can organize ourselves to vaccinate the US population, we could hit 640,000 Americans losing their lives by May. That's the number of Americans who lost their lives in the Spanish flu pandemic, but over a several year period. So we're looking at something on that order of catastrophe. And this is why there's that. I've been really pushing hard for the American people to have that urgency to vaccinate, and the same globally, and why the countries in the Middle East and North Africa need to recognize that building vaccine development capacity is not a trinket. It's vital to the security of the country. I mean, right now, COVID-19 has produced so much instability. It's no longer a public health threat. I mean, it is a public health threat, but it's also a homeland security threat. It is threatening the homeland security of the country. And I would argue the same could be true of many of the Middle Eastern and North African countries. And so there has to be people are quick to invest in nuclear deterrence. They're quick to invest in having tanks and guns and cannon and artillery, but they're going to have to come to terms with the fact that there's got to be a modest investment in vaccine development capability. It's incumbent on every leader of the Arabic countries to look after their populations and do this.
You and I chatted just a bit about that, and some of the countries. So it depends on the countries in the Middle East, because some of them have done a much better job than we have with getting the vaccine disseminated to their citizens and their residents, like UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, and Saudi's doing a really great job of
Yeah,
a
no,
rollout.
listen, they have
They're
good
the
health.
ones that are
They
in
have good.
trouble.
They have good health systems. Actually, they have health systems. We don't have a health system. We have, what do we have? We have the hospital chains. We have Amazon Pharmacy, Rite Aid, Costco, Sam's Club, Walmart, CVS, and Walgreens. That's our health system, and
So,
we're not set up to, and we clearly failed to do anything about controlling COVID-19, and we failed. Now we're failing to vaccinate the American people.
so Operation Warp Speed. Um, what is the transition from that, and how do you see the Biden administration kind of taking that on? And are you optimistic that his advisors are going to take this more seriously?
Well, I think the it's not the Trump administration didn't take Operation Warp Speed seriously. It was a good program, and it was a well-run program by Moncef Slaoui, and congratulations to him. I mean, it was a strong development program. I think there were a couple of disappointments in the sense that it wasn't expansive enough. I mean, it was just focused on development. When we heard about a 4-star military general was involved in logistics, my interpretation was by logistics they meant they were going to get the United States military, or at least a National Guard, involved in helping to vaccinate the American people. I didn't realize till later, maybe I just wasn't paying attention, that by logistics they meant putting the boxes into the back of FedEx and UPS trucks, and sending them off to the States and keeping them cold. That's what they meant by logistics. And so we never really had a plan to vaccinate the American people. So that was disappointing. I think I made a statement to the effect that they loaded 40 million boxes of IKEA furniture into the backs of the trucks, and then the states opened them up and then saw that it says assembly required, and they didn't get the Allen wrench to go with it. So we've got to fix that. And then there was never an adequate communication plan for this either. So these are the kinds of things the Biden administration is supposed to fix. He and I put out an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. I'm not the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, earlier this week, about what I think the Biden administration should be doing on that front, and the sort of the 3 or 4 step plan that they need to put in place. And my understanding is the Biden administration is going to make an announcement either today or tonight about their plan. I don't know if it's because of what I wrote in the Washington Post or in spite of what I wrote in the Washington Post, but we'll see how closely
Well,
the two
we've seen
resemble
you
each other.
we've seen you on CNN and the BBC and all sorts of networks. And so your message is getting out there, and we really appreciate that. We don't have too much time with you left. I think that from a practical standpoint, we understand that the dissemination of this vaccine is still going to be a challenge, not only here in the US, but globally. So we've got still an uphill deal here. But from a practicality perspective, is this vaccine going to become part of our annual deal? Like we have to, some do and some don't get their flu vaccine. Is some, is, are we going to have to get our flu vaccine and our COVID vaccine every year from now on?
Well, you definitely have to get your flu vaccine every year. COVID-19 vaccine, it depends. So, and for different reasons. So with the flu vaccine, it's different because the virus undergoes major shifts. So we do this carefully orchestrated dance globally where we create a brand new flu vaccine every year. For COVID-19, I don't think it'll go through those major shifts, but we might have to give booster shots in order to maintain immunity. So even though the first vaccines are 2 doses, a third dose might be necessary, or a fourth, in order to maintain immunity. And so we're going to have a lot of situational awareness out there to know what the durability of protection is. I mean, this is one of the issues around Operation Warp Speed, and we had to do it. We couldn't. Ordinarily, you wait 2 years in order to collect all of the efficacy and safety data that you need. But 4,000 Americans dying every day, you do the math, it would have just resulted in a catastrophic loss of life. So that's why we released it after 2 or 3 months of data. So we don't really know the durability of protection yet, but we'll learn that over the next year and the next couple of years. But there's going to have to be enormous amount of communication between government scientists and the American people, and I would say in all the respective governments that are represented here. And we haven't really done that before, so hopefully we'll organize ourselves to fix that.
So in Indonesia, for example, their approach is that they're vaccinating younger people, or I believe it's between 18 to 50 or some range like that, because those are the people that are out there in society still working, rather than our approach, which was over 70 and now over 65. From the perspective of a population, do you think that makes more sense?
I would say neither approach makes more sense. I think we tend to overthink it. We try to play the system. Listen, first of all, there's enormous amount of transmission going on. Everybody's going to be affected. We need to basically vaccinate the entire adult population, and we have to figure it out. We have to become countries again that are willing to do hard things and stop trying to take shortcuts. So I think the Indonesian strategy is off base, because you need to protect older individuals who will die from this disease. And I think the U.S. strategy is, we're trying to, those restrictions are too fussy. There's no way to operationalize them. I understand the 1A one to vaccinate the healthcare workers and the nursing homes, nursing facilities, but beyond that, we just have to vaccinate anyone who's willing to get vaccinated and create that high throughput mechanism and system to vaccinate. And this business of targeting specific groups, it's going to fail, and it's not based on sound scientific evidence.
Very good, very good. Thank you so much for your time. It's not like you don't have anything better to do. You're really become a very important voice in this unfortunate but a situation that we're all facing globally together. I want to thank all the participants on this webinar, and may we invite you back again.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember this is a fluid situation. If you look at the events 6 months ago, it looks so different from today. And by the summer, the world's going to look very different yet again. So happy to always come back and do a refresher, because this is a pretty fluid situation.
When is your book coming out?
I should be out in a couple of weeks. So I think
We'll
you
be
can
sure to.
pre-order it now on Amazon or whatever. And it's, as I call it, it's called Preventing the Next Pandemic.
It's going to be a must have, I think, in every household. I thank you very much for your time. I'll probably see you later on CNN. So I thank you for those appearances.
Thank you.
You've been a
Thank you
great
so
person.
much. And thanks for giving attention to this issue. It's been a real honor to be working with you over the years. We're a good team.
Thank you, sir. Good day. Bye bye, and
Bye-bye.
good night, and good day to everybody that has joined us. Thank you.